Welcome to the Eddie Hyatt Podcast. I'm your host and teacher, Eddie Hyatt. So glad to be back with you this morning as we continue our journey through the book of Acts, the earliest history of the church and the history of the early church, the earliest history of the church and the, the earliest history of the church and it is also the history of the earliest church, the earliest history of the church, and the history of the earliest church. So, and what I want to talk to you today about is I want to ask you a question: Are you able? Would you be able to lead a Jew to Jesus as the Messiah using the Old Testament scriptures? I believe that every Christian should be able to take the Old Testament and lead a Jew to Jesus by showing them Jesus in the Old Testament. Now, I'm going to be reading and have an incredible story to tell you along these lines, a testimony. So bear with me here. But let's start reading we're in chapter 17 now. Boy, we spent a lot of time in Acts 16 because there's so much in Acts 16. So we pick up in Acts 17:1, where they have left Philippi and they're continuing on into Macedonia based on the vision that Paul had seen in Troas, which we read about in Acts 16:10, where he saw a man of Macedonia saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And so they're now leaving Philippi in chapter 17, verse 1. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonis, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as his custom was, this was his custom, this was his modus operandi, this was his mode of operation. Then Paul, as his custom was, went into them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them for 3 weeks, 3 Sabbaths, reasoned with them from the scriptures. Now, what's he referring to the scriptures? Now, they didn't have a New Testament. This was before the New Testament. So he's reasoning with them from what we call the Old Testament. Again, there was no New Testament at this time. And he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ, that is the Messiah, had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ, is the Messiah." In other words, this is the one that you have been looking for. This is the Messiah prophesied in our Old Testament scriptures. And so I'm here to tell you he has come. And it is this Jesus. Jesus has fulfilled those Old Testament prophecies. So now notice this again. I want you to see this. This was Paul's mode of operation. He would go into a city, and this is in the Gentile world, and because he was a Pharisee and a teacher of Judaism, he always had an opening in the local synagogue. And then he would go there and he would take their scriptures, which was also his scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, and he would use those scriptures to argue and convince them that Jesus was the Messiah. So that is why I'm asking the question: Do you have the ability to take the Old Testament and point out the passages that Jesus fulfilled? All of those Old Testament promises, and there's some that's very obvious. For example, take Isaiah. Is it chapter 9? Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Prince of Peace, the Everlasting Father, and of his kingdom and peace there will be no end. There are prophecies about where the Messiah would be born. And thou, Bethlehem Ephratah. This is in Micah. I believe it's Micah chapter 4, chapter 5, verse 1? It says, "And thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, even though you are smallest among the thousands of Judah, out of you shall come him who will be ruler for me in Israel." Out of where? Out of Bethlehem. Yeah. It's telling where the Messiah will come from. And it also tells that the Messiah has an eternal existence. Let me quote that again. I don't have it in front of me, but I've read it enough. Let me just say it. Say it. And thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, even though you are the smallest among the thousands of Judah, out of you will come him who is to be ruler from me in Israel, even him who is from old, from everlasting. And the Hebrew word means from eternity. In other words, it tells us the Messiah is going to come out of Bethlehem, but yet he will have an eternal existence. You see, that is such an incredible. That's just one of so many. There are prophecies about that he would be a descendant of David. There's prophecies about his death and all kinds of details surrounding his death, such as that people would gamble for his clothes, that his death would be an atoning death. There's even scriptures about the Messiah rising from the dead, and so Paul would go in and he would take their scriptures. He would tell them about Jesus, the things that had happened to him, and how Jesus had fulfilled all of these Old Testament prophecies. And he would say, "This Jesus I'm preaching to you, he is the Messiah. He has come." Now, I want to tell you a testimony. When I was a student at Christ for the Nations, there was a guest speaker who came, spoke for a week. His name was Manny Brotman. He's gone on to be to heaven. He was Jewish, and at that time he was the rabbi and the pastor of a messianic congregation. And by a messianic congregation, these were Jews and Gentiles who had accepted Jesus as the Messiah, but they still kept all of the Jewish traditions and festivals, the Passover, Feast of Tabernacles, and so on, and they had their service on Saturday. And so he came to Christ for the Nations and spoke for a week, very Christ-centered message, and the topic was how to introduce a Jew to the Messiah. And basically, he was showing the students how to take the Old Testament scriptures and use them to introduce a Jew to Jesus as the Messiah. Uh, I really don't remember the details of it, but I must have been impressed because I bought the tapes. And later, I was married. Sue and I moved to Canada, but I had those tapes with me, and we were planting a church in St. John, New Brunswick, and I got a call from a counseling center, Christian counseling center there in town, which was a counseling center for 100 Huntley Street, which was a nationwide television program, and and they had counseling centers in different cities, and the people would volunteer, and they would take calls, and they would pray for people, and so on. Well, the woman, I still remember her name, Elaine Jenner, I believe was her name, who was a director, a good woman, Anglican woman, what we'd call Episcopal, but born again, loved Jesus. She called me and she said, "Would you have anything to give to a young Jewish man who has stopped in?" And I believe she said he had just accepted the Lord. So I thought of that tape or tapes. And I don't remember if it was one tape or tapes that I gave him. But what I remember, I was very busy. I was very busy. We were planting a new congregation. Life was busy. I drove by, handed this young man the tape, shook his hand, went on my way, didn't give it another thought. 13 years later, Sue and I had moved from St. John. We were there for 8 years. I think we were living in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time, and we were ministering in Ontario, in a town called Hamilton, just south of Toronto. And I was ministering in a church pastored by Bill Prankard, who was actually a very well-known evangelist, but also he had, I don't know if he had begun this church or if he had taken over the pastorate of an already existent church, but it was with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. I would guess it would seat about 300 people, and it was packed out that morning. And now this is 13 years later from the time I had given this young Jewish man in St. John, New Brunswick, this tape. 13 years later, 1,000 miles away in another city. So I preached that morning, and after the service, a young man comes up to me, and he shakes my hand, a big smile, and he says, "Do you remember me?" And I'm a little embarrassed because it seemed like he thinks I should remember him. I said, "No, I'm sorry. What is your name?" He told me his name. I'm even more embarrassed. And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not. I'm, I don't remember. It's not ringing a bell." He said, "Do you remember giving a tape to a young Jewish boy in St. John, New Brunswick years ago?" "Oh, yeah, I remember that." He said, "Well, that was me. Remember, the name of the tape was How to Introduce a Jew to the Messiah." He said, "That was me." He said, "And that was exactly what I needed at that time." And he said, "I am now here in this area, and I am pastoring a messianic congregation in Toronto." In other words, he's pastoring a Jewish congregation that has embraced Jesus as the Messiah. And he said, "I saw in the newspaper where you were going to be speaking here today." And he said, "We had our service yesterday, which would have been the Jewish Sabbath, Saturday." And he said, and he gestured to people who were sitting behind us, several rows of people. He said, "So I brought my entire congregation here to hear you this morning." Wow. A young man who was introduced to the Messiah out of the Old Testament scriptures. Oh, my friends, are you able to introduce a Jew to the Messiah? Can you take the Old Testament? I tell you, it can be a powerful tool also for introducing Gentiles to the New Testament because it shows how how in such detail that Jesus, hundreds and even thousands of years later, fulfilled in detail these Old Testament prophecies. Let me recommend a book that can help you in this. It's a book I wrote called Discovering the Real Jesus. And I have one entire chapter in there about the Old Testament prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. So that chapter would go a long ways in equipping you, be ready and prepared to use the Old Testament to introduce a Jew to the Messiah. Who knows? You might get an invitation to speak at a synagogue. You might, in your work, in your business, you may wind up working with friends with a Jewish person. And God will open the door and the opportunity for you to share the story of the Messiah and how Jesus fulfilled all the Old Testament prophets and prophecies about the coming Messiah. Well, I'll post that book below on the there on my the website today on Podbean where we're broadcasting from these episodes. And so I'm Eddie Hyatt. This is the Eddie Hyatt podcast. I look forward to seeing you on Monday. God bless you.